in the way we trade and in the way we conduct business. And we want to see less reliance on autocrats. In short, we stand for free trade among free nations. And that's also the mission of my two co-panelists, which is a privilege to introduce. Perth Toll is the founder of Life and Liberty Indexes and sponsor of the Freedom 100 Emerging Markets ETF, which stands for an exchange trade fund, the world's first freedom weight emerging markets equity strategy. So we look forward to hearing about that. Matthias Döpfner is both the chairman of the Springer Freedom Foundation, that will also give an award out later here today, and of course also the CEO of Axel Springer, one of the leading digital publishers, which includes Politico, our media partner here for this Copenhagen Democracy Summit, and other publications such as Welt and Bild. And his latest book, Dealing with Dictators, on international trade politics and how to safeguard democracies, has been published recently. I have it here in a German version. I highly encourage it as recommended reading. Matthias, let me start with you. You have a long-standing career in media and in the business world. I think you could have, in Germany, chosen the easy path to go along with the sort of German consensus that business and geopolitics don't really mix. I would then ask you, why did you choose sort of the hard route and write a book like this and sort of stand up for something, also being at the same time a business CEO?
Well, it's true that a couple of friends really recommended me not to write it because I would make even more enemies. But I think, you know, what's the purpose of life to somehow support what you really believe in, and that's why I became a journalist. I became a journalist because I believe in the free and open society model, in the value of freedom, in human rights, and that's basically my intrinsic motivation to become a journalist, to become a media manager, and the same motivation to write that book. I mean, I simply observed for many years how freedom and democracy is globally in decline, how autocrats are getting stronger. I was particularly worried about the developments after the annexation of Crimea and thought there's going to be more if we are not doing what Kaja Kallas just recommended in the panel, to defend democracies with strength. And when that then happened, the next step to invade the whole of Ukraine, I thought I now really have to write that book. Because business and society are absolutely connected. I mean, the war in Ukraine, the war of Hamas and the proxies of Iran on Israel, and the potential takeover of Taiwan are all related. It's about weakening democracy, weakening the biggest democracy in the world, the United States, split Europe and the United States, and a very important tool in that context is also business. Russian Russian gas pipelines, as well as China's abuse of the asymmetric rules of the WTO for 2 decades, which enabled them to become the second biggest democracy, the second biggest economy in the world. These things are related, and I just had this intrinsic motivation to write a book as a citizen, not as a CEO of a publishing company.
And now it's come out. There's a reason actually why I took the German edition. Apart from that, it was a pleasure to read it in that language, is because that's really where the crux in Europe is Germany. It has been on Russia, as you just mentioned. It still is on China. I mean, there is an agenda that Ursula von der Leyen, the Commission President, who was here last year speaking, set in motion of de-risking. We've not really heard about that. I mean, I think it's all, of course, because it's all about President Trump and his policies at the moment. But there's still a big open question whether Europe now is ready with a much more recalcitrant US to sort of carry out that de-risking agenda and particularly in Germany. So I would ask, are you succeeding? Or are people both reading the book and saying, hey, Matthias, you did have a point by writing it?
Well, first of all, I was told it's a very principal rule of diplomacy not to speak negatively about your own country on foreign ground. Fortunately, I'm not a diplomat, so I can say that Germany is the negative role model in dealing with China, because their kind of naive and opportunistic policy has led to a very developed dependency. The German car industry is already now very dependent on China, and we see what that does. Dependency is never a good basis for healthy trade. China is now really about to destroy the German car industry, and maybe that is a late and painful learning. Maybe there are incredible opportunities now with a new government that may take a different route. I think optimism is a duty, so let's hope for the best.
Thank you, Matthias. Perth, I now turn to you. And let me also mention to all of you out here, we're open to audience questions. So put them in the session, go into your app, put them in the session, and they'll appear magically and digitally up here, so I can take them as part of our conversation. Perth, you've done some of this that we're talking about. How can we actually invest more in freedom rather than autocrats by making this financial product that enables investors to put their money where their values are? But tell us a little bit actually how it works, because it's definitely something that I personally, having also advocated this, and Matthias the same in his book, we want to see this happen in practice, but often we don't necessarily have the tools. And this is at least one financial kind of possibility for doing that.
Yeah, so what my company does is we sponsor an ETF, an exchange-traded fund that invests in the freest emerging markets. So in the emerging markets investing space, there's a lot of autocracies. China, Russia, Saudi Arabia historically have always been the top 10. China currently has about 30% in most emerging markets benchmarks. And these are benchmarks that all of the world's asset allocators, all the biggest pensions and asset managers in the world have to benchmark to. So if MSCI, Emerging Markets Index, has 35% in China, all of these people have to have 35% in China. So we are really funneling money to autocracies without even meaning to. The reason for that is it's market capitalization weighted. That's the standard weighting mechanism for most investment indices. So what we do instead is we freedom weight, and we're using third-party freedom data from the Cato Institute and the Fraser Institute that combines 86 variables on both personal and economic freedoms. And we use the composite country score to come up with our country weights. So instead of having China, Russia, Saudi Arabia in the top 10, we have Taiwan, South Korea, Chile, Poland in the top holdings. Poland and Chile being very small countries that get about 1% weight in the MSCI benchmark that everyone benchmarks to, but have about 14% weight in our index. So we've never had any China, Russia, Saudi Arabia in our index. At the time of Russia's invasion of Ukraine, we were the only emerging markets fund that did not have Russia for this very reason of their lack of freedom. So we've done well over the past several years, and ETFs are a topic that maybe doesn't get a lot of play in conferences like this, but you can be sure the dictators are paying attention. So 6 months ago, Xi Jinping visited Saudi Arabia. Shortly thereafter, Saudi Arabia launched a Saudi Arabian ETF on the Hong Kong exchange. China launched a Chinese ETF in Saudi Arabia, and they each seeded the other's ETF with $1 billion. The good news I'm here to tell you today is that our fund in the US, the FRDM Freedom 100 Emerging Markets ETF, has currently just about $1 billion under management. So freedom investors are truly undefeated. We have seeded our own ETF, the freer countries, with as much money as the autocrats have just given each other. So that's what we do, and I'm so happy to be here to be able to talk with you guys.
One point maybe to elaborate, because you touched upon it briefly, but I think, again, the point that in all our pension funds, the way, as you just explained, I would say, give us that one more time. I mean, the fact that we actually, end up through our pension funds that are marked on the MSCI, we more or less automatically, when something is called emerging markets, we end up with whatever number it was, like 35% China. I mean, how that whole, because I think a lot of ordinary people are not really aware of this, and that's why I think there has to be alternatives, but there also just have to be a kind of awareness about all of us, the way we have pension funds. I mean, at least if I speak from a Danish case, it's mostly climate. That's the only thing you can choose, which is a good thing.
Right.
But you don't really have the option to say, call your pension fund and say, I want to invest more in democracy, I want to invest more in freedom. What are your options for that?
Yeah, and Europe especially has been a leader in ESG and kind of the climate investing. But ESG isn't enough, because Hike Vision also has great ESG report, and so does Huawei and all these Chinese companies that are, helping the Chinese military as well. So the pensions, basically, they have to follow a benchmark. So there's a thing called tracking error, and a tracking error is how much you deviate from the benchmark, and each asset manager only has a certain tracking error budget. So they do not like to deviate from the benchmark. Also, that is job risk, right? So if you deviate from the benchmark and you underperform, then you're out of a job. But if you're tracking the benchmark, then you're fine. So most asset managers don't like to deviate too much from the benchmarks. And by mandate, most pensions cannot deviate too much from benchmarks. So that benchmark being set by MSCI is what the world's asset managers follow. So most emerging markets funds, if you're just in a iShares emerging markets or Vanguard emerging markets ETF, it is going to have about 30% in China, and you're going to have Saudi Arabia in the top 10, Russia historically, also Egypt, Turkey, Qatar, UAE, just a lot of these more autocratic countries. And that's just the nature of the emerging markets universe. So that's why we started with emerging markets. There's also developed market funds, which are countries like Denmark, US, Canada, and there's frontier market funds, which are for the smaller countries. So in the emerging market space is where the autocracy risk is the highest because of the nature of the universe.
Thanks, Perth. Matthias, I turn over to you again. And now that you said before that you're not a diplomat, I'll ask you a non-diplomatic question on the new German government. I mean, the previous one made what was in German called the Zeitenwende, that there's going to be a complete change. Is there going to be that? And do you think the new Chancellor Merkel, who also comes from a business background, does he really get this of like the sort of the German naivety that Wandel durch Handel, which has really been sort of the key motto of German business, has to change in a way of where autocrats use these economic levers on us?
The honest answer is I cannot tell. I think he has a fair chance. I hope that he learned from the mistakes of his predecessors. I hope that he doesn't listen too much on the short-term pressure of some corporations. But I think there is reason to be optimistic. I mean, let's put it into context. I was writing that book a couple of years ago with a concrete proposal. And that proposal was that in order to avoid the rise of totalitarian systems by the rise of their economies, you have to strengthen the democratic open society economies. This you can only do if you basically cease operations of WTO, if you establish a new alliance of democratic economies based on a zero tariff trade relationship. There are very clear but simplistic and minimalistic membership rules. You can become a member if you respect the rule of law, if you respect human rights, and if you respect very basic CO2 targets. And based on that, you do tariff-free trade. The idea and the optimal outcome that I described was the transatlantic alliance starts with that. Then other democracies join, Japan, Australia, African countries, Latin American countries, and most importantly, India. And then we have a real leverage. Then we can negotiate with non-democratic countries, either symmetric terms or simply impose high prohibited tariffs on them. When the new administration in America took office, it looked at the very beginning that they would do exactly the opposite. Exactly the precise opposite of what I suggested. Tariff wars between democracies, which would only push Europe closer to China, which would strengthen China and Russia and other non-democracies, and would achieve exactly the opposite. Now, suddenly, there is a surprising change and shift, and new talks and new words are in the conversations. And I was so happy to hear our chancellor speaking to the president on the phone and suggesting, let's do no tariff trade together. Maybe there is a surprisingly positive outcome. Maybe you need the crisis. You need to look basically into a potential disaster in order to avoid it. So I would remain realistically optimistic that we get a bit closer to a fairer, more symmetrical trade system based on low or no tariffs among democracies.
Great. I actually have a follow-up question. I think that links to that, Matthias. Then I'll take that to you and then turn to Perth. Matthias, it's refreshing to see you as a business leader speak out on the importance of democracy and pushing back on autocrats. In the United States, business leaders have been much more careful and reserved when their voice is badly needed right now. What would you say to American business leaders who privately feel the way you do about the importance of protecting democracy, but are nervous about speaking out?
Speak up. That's the very simple sentence that I would say, and that I am saying. I mean, I just spent 10 days in America, the West Coast, and at the East Coast, and had conversations like that. I really think it is an absolute reliable signature of an open society that people dare to speak up and say what they think. If powerful business leaders, billionaires who really have a lot of power and influence and independence through their wealth, don't dare to speak up, that is something that I find personally very scary. Now we have to analyze, is it because the system is already that autocratic that they face, I don't know, horrible consequences, go to jail? I didn't see that so far. Maybe it's more cowardice or opportunism, and that I think is not the right guiding principle. So my very concrete recommendation would be speak up and check the consequences. Perhaps you can say more than you think.
Thanks, Matthias. I have a question for you, Perth. How do you position your ETF to appeal to the average investor, which primarily focuses on long-term security and returns? So I think that's, if I translate it, it's just like, can we still make money on freedom?
Yeah, so when I first started this, I had no expectations in the short term going in of what the market would do, because market could do anything short term. But I absolutely believe that long-term freedom would win and would outperform. We've been around for 6 years now. This is our anniversary month, 6-year anniversary this month. And we've strongly outperformed in our benchmark. I believe we are currently second percentile by Morningstar for year to date, and top decile and top quartile consistently throughout our performance history. This is something that I didn't expect, and I don't want investors to expect this every year. I do expect freedom to outperform in the end, but in the short term, again, anything can happen. And when China outperforms, for example, we will underperform. And we've done that in times when China has outperformed, like the first half of COVID. But then you look at the recoveries, and freer markets typically recover much faster because they're more flexible to respond to market trends versus having central planning government telling them what to do. And also, we look at both personal and economic freedom metrics. So we do look at trade metrics, free trade, tariffs, non-tariff trade barriers, freedom of people to move around, movement of people and capital. And the freer the trade, the higher the score in our index. So we do look at both personal and economic freedoms as well. So most investors resonate more with the economic freedom part initially, but it's all interconnected. As we can see, you don't have personal freedom if you don't have economic freedom, and vice versa. So it all works together, and I'm happy to report that the freer countries, at least in the emerging market space, have strongly outperformed the less free countries in at least our history. Yeah.
To both of you, I have a question here. With the declining support to human rights defenders from the democratic states, how can business dial up its support to civil society in autocracies?
How can business...
Yeah, I mean, I know you're, but Matthias maybe first, but
Yep.
and feel free to answer it just on a personal basis, Perth, as well. I know it's not what you invest in. Right?
I mean, in general, human rights remain underappreciated as long as they remain abstract. So a lot of leaders, business leaders, politicians sometimes have their kind of off-the-record conversations. Yeah, come on, let's not care too much about human rights. It's almost like a nice to have. It changes completely when somebody experiences very concretely the consequences in a country where the rule of law and human rights do not exist or are not respected. If somebody ends up in jail, if somebody ends up tortured, if somebody gets killed, if somebody gets blackmailed or kidnapped, and we have seen that. Perhaps we as media companies are a bit more sensitive because we have this experience. We had reporters in Iran in jail. We had a reporter for a year in a Turkish jail. We had people killed in Russia because of independent reporting. We had people killed in the Balkan countries. So we have made these experiences very physically and very concretely, and I can only recommend that perhaps we tell these stories as concrete as possible, because that may also make business leaders and leaders from all areas a bit more sensitive. It's not a luxury, it's a fundament.
Thanks, Matthias. You actually join me in applauding, because we are out of time now. I could go on this topic. I think it's extremely important. Matthias Döpfner, Perth Toll, thanks a lot for sharing the stage.